Stop bugging me. Mom, she's bugging me. Stop bugging your brother, sweetie. Those were words that were heard often in our house in years past because one of our kids, and I won't say which one, but she loved to bug her big brothers. What does it mean to bug someone? Back in 1964, Charles Schulz, probably mostly known for the comic strip Peanuts, he wrote a book that was titled, "What Was Buggin' Old Pharaoh?" And the book title there, What Was Bugging Old Pharaoh, it really kind of brings our minds to the third and fourth plagues that we're going to focus on this morning. I've been thinking about it. I was like, wouldn't it be cool if the expression, bugging me, stop bugging me, or will you quit bugging me? I don't know where that expression came from, but wouldn't it be cool if it came from the third and fourth plagues? Maybe it did. I don't know that for sure, but that's going to be our focus this morning. Turn, if you would, to Exodus chapter 8 as we continue our series, The Lesson, this morning by considering verses 16 through 32 and the third and fourth plagues on Egypt. These plagues were ones that really bugged the people. Last week we saw in verses 1 through 15 the plague of frogs. The frogs were all dead now. They're rotting and stinking flesh, all heaped up in large piles around the land. Pharaoh, with his hard heart, had reneged on his promise to let the people go. And so, with no warning this time to Pharaoh, notice that, no warning to Pharaoh, comes the next plague, the third plague, in verses 16 through 19. So look at those verses, Exodus chapter 8, verses 16 through 19. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth, so that it may become gnats in all the land of Egypt.' And they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats in all the land of Egypt. The magicians tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, 'This is the finger of God.' But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said." Here in these verses 16 through 19, we learn about the distress of Egypt. That's point number one this morning, the distress of Egypt. Notice in verse 16, the Lord did not say to Moses, and usually we don't like to focus on what's not present in the text, but in this case, because you have a series of plagues that have been repeated, it's worth noting that in most of the plagues, we begin with the Lord telling Moses what to say to Pharaoh. But notice that that's not the case in this plague, this third plague. In verse 16, the Lord did not say to Moses, "Speak to Pharaoh," but rather say to Aaron. And what did he say? "Stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth so that it may become gnats in all the land of Egypt." This plague, like we'll see again in the sixth plague, and then again in the ninth plague, so every three plagues comes with no warning to Pharaoh. Moses is not instructed in the third, the sixth, and the ninth plague to give Pharaoh a warning. I don't know why that is. The only thing I could figure out is 3 strikes and you're out, so it's every third one. I don't know what it is, but that's just something to take note of, that the third, the sixth, and the ninth plagues come with no warning to Pharaoh. But we also see that I want to take you back to last week, that the frogs were all dead. They were piled up and rotting and stinking. And I think about all those bugs. How many of you remember when you were like in, I don't know, probably like 7th grade science class, and they showed the movie? Remember movies? Back in the days before videos, there were movies, and the teacher would get the reel-to-reel thing going, and they'd show, and there would always be that slow motion picture of the frog eating the bug. Remember that? and the frog would slowly open its mouth, and then out would shoot that tongue really slow. Obviously, I don't know what kind of speed they were using on that, but they'd show that tongue, they'd reach out, I don't know how far the tongue of the frog would go out, and they'd get that bug, it'd stick to its tongue, and bring it back, and he'd chomp the bug down, Frogs like to eat bugs. Wouldn't it have been handy to have some of those frogs still in Egypt to eat some of these bugs? It's interesting that Pharaoh had reneged on his promise. He said to Moses, pray for me, and if you get rid of these frogs, I'll let you go. Moses prayed. The frogs went away. The frogs all died. And Moses said, I'm not letting you go. He reneged on his promise, and it's kind of a fitting third plague that comes with no warning that it would be these gnats or these bugs that would come upon the earth with no frogs to help control the population of all of these bugs. I also want you to notice that at the end of verse 16, and we see it again at the end of verse 17, it says that the gnats were where? It says they were in all the land of Egypt. Brothers and sisters, we cannot miss the inundation of the gnats. The inundation of the gnats. This plague was an all-out barrage of these insects, and the land was totally deluged with gnats. Now, I want you to notice in verses 16 and 17 that God's instruction was for Aaron to strike the dust of the earth, and when he struck the dust of the earth, the dust turns in miraculously into these gnats. But it wasn't just there. It wasn't just where Moses or where Aaron struck the dust of the earth. It was all throughout the whole land of Egypt. These gnats appear and they begin to swarm all across the land. The inundation of the gnats. You say, Pastor Mike, why are you making a big deal about this? Well, I'm going to come back to why, but I want you to take note of this, and I'll swing back to this inundation of gnats a little bit later. Let's talk about what Aaron did. He struck the dust of the earth. Verses 16, Moses tells him to strike the dust, and in verse 17, he struck the dust. The same Hebrew word. If you look back at Exodus chapter 7, verse 20, Moses struck the river. Same word. We saw it this morning as Pastor Jeff was leading us in communion, that God says, I will strike the people of Egypt with the 10th plague, and he struck them, it says. I haven't investigated that word, but I'm guessing it's probably the same Hebrew word. Actually, the first time we saw that word in our first series in Exodus last year, in fact, go ahead and turn back to chapter 3, and I'm going to look at verses 19 and 20. And I'll have a little bit easier time finding verses 19 and 20 this week because some of you might have noticed I've got a little bit bigger Bible. Now, this is not large print, all right? I repeat, this is not large print. I don't care what the box that it came in said. It's just a little bit bigger font. Last week I was having trouble finding the text I was looking for, so I got a little bit bigger font here. But in chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, we read this. God says, but I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand, so I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go. Same word. I will strike the land. It's the same word that is used throughout the plagues to strike, that God is going to strike the land. And he tells Moses to strike the river, and he tells Aaron to strike the dust of the earth. And that whole idea of striking, it carries this idea of not just of reaching out and like throwing a punch or hitting something. That is contained in this Hebrew word. But clearly I want you to see that it is meant to be a punitive action. That this striking is meant to be punishment. Yahweh meant for these plagues to punish, but he also meant to reveal himself to the Egyptians and to the Israelites. We've seen that. We've talked about that previously. So when God turned the Nile River to blood and caused the rivers to swarm with frogs, God was punishing the people. But he was also revealing himself through first eroding their worldview, their belief in their gods. In fact, again, we saw it this morning as Pastor Jeff was leading us in worship, that God's judgment wasn't just against the people of Egypt, but against their gods. This was what God was doing with each of these plagues, was showing the people not only was he sovereign and in control, not only was he all-powerful, but that the gods that they believed in were impotent and worthless and nothing. And that's what we see in the first two plagues that were plagues against the river. And now we see it here again. It's significant that Aaron struck the dust of the earth to initiate this third plague. Again, the Egyptians, I remind you, they believed in three realms over which their gods had sovereign control. The river, the first two plagues were plagues against the river. They also believed that their gods had sovereign control over the land and the sky. We'll get to the sky later, but here we see that Aaron strikes the dust of the earth. And that is because God wants to reveal that through this plague, their earth god that they called Geb was nothing more than a heathen concept. Geb was not real, but Yahweh was going to show the Egyptians that he is real and that he alone is God. Notice also in verse 17, and we see it again at the end of verse 18, that these gnats were on man and beast. That's an important point because we cannot miss the irritation of the gnats. The irritation of the gnats, that's next. When I think of gnats, I don't know about you, but I kind of think, if I'm outdoors and there's like these little swarms, small little groups of these bugs, sometimes you kind of walk into them and, they fly up your nose. You ever had one of those fly up your nose? Yeah, sometimes they buzz in your ear. Sometimes they'll even, if you're talking, they might fly down your throat. That's what I think of as gnats. But that's probably not what the idea here is, because the Hebrew word that is translated as gnats is the word cane, and the word cane means an insect that fastens itself. So what we think of as gnats, or at least what I do, things that they don't really fasten themselves. Yeah, they might fly up your nose or something, but they're not fastening themselves to you. So it's probably a different insect, and in fact, scholars have kind of narrowed it down to probably two main candidates for this insect that's translated here as gnats from the Hebrew word cane. And the first possibility, and there's both strong possibilities, the first is lice. In fact, the King James Version translates the Hebrew word cane as lice. Now, I'm thankful that I have never had lice before, but every once in a while I'll hear of someone that has lice or that gets lice. And I was watching a TV program not too long ago, and it's one of those reality shows, where they do, they interview people and then they show their interaction and stuff. And in that episode, some of the people in that program, they got lice. And it went through the whole thing that they needed to do to get rid of the lice. And that once that happened, once that was revealed in that program, I'm telling you, the whole show as I'm watching, I couldn't stop scratching my scalp. Anyone else ever go through that? Anyone else experience that phenomenon? All you have to do is hear about lice, and you start scratching your scalp, right? You just think, oh man, I've got them. And I'll tell you what, in preparing this lesson, Monday and Tuesday, when I was studying on Monday, when I was writing this manuscript out on Tuesday, I'll tell you what, I scratched my scalp a lot thinking about this lice. And when I found those pictures, I don't even know why I put those pictures up there because they kind of freak me out. But the idea of lice, and that could have been what this plague was, because they do sort of fasten themselves to people. The other strong possibility for the bug described by the Hebrews, by the Hebrew is the Hebrew word cane, is the mosquito. And the reason that the mosquito is such a strong possibility is that this bug fastens itself to man and beast with its sting. as it bites to draw the blood from man and beast. It fastens itself to people. And so some people think some scholars think that the mosquito might be what was indicated here by the Hebrew word cain, that is translated in the ESV as gnats. Mosquitoes, of course, can be very irritating and leave you with days of irritation with the itchy bites that they leave behind. Now, I kind of favor mosquito as the translation for two reasons. Number one, if it's mosquito, I can stop scratching my scalp as I think about lice. And number two, I've had a lot of people come to me and say, why did God ever create the mosquito? I know I could have an answer. Maybe I've got an answer for them now. It was actually a plague on Egypt. And what's interesting is that in this plague, we don't read about the ending to this plague. Did you notice that? There was no, all the mosquitoes then died, or all the gnats went away, or they flew. It just doesn't end. Maybe that's why we still have mosquitoes in the world today. I'm just kidding. I don't think that's really the answer to that question. The truth is, I don't know what these gnats were, but I know that they were all over Egypt, that they were on man and beast, and it was some kind of insect that fastens themselves to people. So there was an inundation, there was irritation, and then as we come to the next thing, I want you to notice that these bugs made an impression on the magicians of Pharaoh. So there was the instruction of the gnats. The instruction of the gnats. Remember, throughout this story, Satan has consistently used the magicians, the wise men of Pharaoh, to deceive the king through the use of their magic arts, which were really just demonic powers at work. That Satan used this to draw or to drive the king, the Egyptian king, further and further away from faith in Yahweh. And when Aaron threw down his staff, what did the magicians do? They threw down their staffs. Aaron's staff became a serpent, their staffs became serpents. When Moses struck the Nile River and it became blood, what did the magicians do? They took water, they turned it into blood. When Aaron reached out the staff over the waters and the waters began to swarm with frogs, what did the magicians do? They created more frogs. And it was all part of Satan's strategy to deceive and keep Pharaoh from coming to faith in God and in Yahweh. And so that's what these magicians have been up to this whole time. And it's interesting that this time they're not able to do it. They tried. I mentioned last week, if you remember, that when they produced the frogs, that would be the last time we see them doing this miracle. But it didn't keep them from trying. Okay, they still tried to create more of these gnats. They were unable to do so. And of course, the question then has to be raised, well, why? Why were they not able to do it? And there's one of two possibilities. Either, number one, God just stopped allowing it because our God is sovereign over all. And even though these magicians were using demonic power, the demonic power is still subject to the sovereignty of our God. So it's very possible that God just said, you can't do that anymore. Okay? Another possibility would be that Satan, because his strategy wasn't working. If you go back to last week, remember they created frogs and it didn't really affect Pharaoh a whole lot. In fact, Pharaoh called in Moses and Aaron and said, hey, you got to help me out. And Pharaoh began to realize that my gods are being bested by your God, and so he was the miracles that the magicians were doing were no longer having an effect. So it's possible that Satan just said, hey, that strategy's not working, so he limited that power and wouldn't give the magicians the power. I don't know why they couldn't do it, but I know that they could not do that. They couldn't make more gnats, and that what was being proven through the miracles that they had been doing is that, yes, they can further the plague, but they could not undo the plague. And what was being revealed was that the God of the Hebrews, this Yahweh, was far more powerful than what they believed their gods to be. And that was proven by the fact, remember when the magicians threw their staffs down and they became serpents, that deceived Pharaoh, but Pharaoh probably still noticed that Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. And when they turn the water into blood, Pharaoh's probably a little impressed by that, but as he walked back and went back to his house, he must have realized that, I didn't want more blood. It would have been far better if they could have just turned the blood in the river back into water. But they couldn't do that. And the last thing we needed around here was more frogs. Why can't they make the frogs go away? When Pharaoh brought in Moses and Aaron, he didn't ask them to make more frogs. He said, can you get rid of all these frogs? Why couldn't the magicians do that? Because they are not sovereign. There was demonic power at work, but even the demons, their power, their ability, because they are creatures, was subject to that of the eternal and almighty Creator. And so God was showing himself to be the divine God, the almighty God, the only true and living God. And is that not what he said he would do? He said, through these acts, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord, or I am Yahweh. In other words, they will come to understand that Yahweh is God and that their gods, their pantheon of gods, is nothing, that their worldview is based on lies and deceit and falsehood, and that I am the true and living God. And so these magicians are unable to do this, to create this miracle, and they go into Pharaoh in verse 19, and they say to him, this is the finger of God. Now, I don't know for sure if that is a significant thing or not. The term finger of God, it shows up other places in the Old Testament, so maybe I'm making too much of it, but I just find it interesting that they didn't say this is the hand of God or this is the outstretched arm of God. It's the finger of God. And it almost sounds like they're saying, look, Pharaoh, this is just his finger. We can't stand against the power of this God, Pharaoh. Oh, king, you're great. We love you, but this God is besting us. He's besting our gods. He is showing himself to be more powerful than anything we ever thought or imagined our gods could be. These magicians, these wise men, they got the instruction that they were meant to get. Yet, and I want you to know this, they failed to humbly place their faith in God. They failed to submit themselves to his divine sovereignty. They failed to trust in him. There are a lot of people today in our world who might believe in the concept of God, but they fail to humbly submit their lives to him in faith. They fail to truly bring themselves to a place where they place their faith and trust in the gospel. If you're not sure what that means, the gospel, the instruction of the gospel, it means the good news. It's just the good news. It's the good news that while all humanity is in sin and faces eternal wrath and torment for that sin, God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, who came to offer his life as payment for the redemption of humanity. Because Jesus is God, he is perfect and free from all sin. Because he is also human, he could suffer and die and offer his perfect life to pay that price that you or I could never pay. When Jesus died on the cross, he did so to pay for your freedom from sin that separates you from God now and threatens to separate you from him forever. But death is the wages of what? Death is the wages of sin. Jesus knew no sin. Jesus had no sin. Why? Because he's God. It's impossible for him to sin. He was perfect in every way. And yet he died. Why? To pay for your sin. To pay for my sin. And because Death is the wage of sin. And because Jesus had no sin, then death could not contain him. Death had no right to hold on to him. Listen, if Jesus were a sinner, he'd still be in the grave. The fact that Jesus rose from the dead proves to us that his life was perfect, and therefore his sacrifice for your sin and my sin is sufficient. He lives today, having risen from the dead, to offer to everyone who would just submit their lives to him, who would place their trust, their faith in him. These Egyptian magicians, they began to see. They got the instruction. They started to figure out that the God of the Hebrews is powerful. He's more powerful than our gods. But they never stopped believing in their gods. They never broke their allegiance to their worldview. They never came to the point where they turned away from all the deception and all the sin and never turned in faith to this God of the Hebrews who called himself Yahweh. Friend, if you're here this morning, maybe you've heard the instruction, but you're realizing right now, I have never come to that point in my life where I have turned away from all the sin that condemns me to eternity in hell, and I have never turned in faith to Jesus Christ. If that describes you, I want to invite you right now to turn from your sin. We call that repentance. And to turn in faith to Jesus Christ and trust him to forgive you, to wash your sin away, and to save you. If you have questions about that, if you need to talk more about that, would you please come and see me or see any one of our members here this morning before you leave? I'm quite confident that if you talk to any member of this church and just say, hey, I have questions about this Jesus, I have questions about faith, I am sure that either they will talk to you or they will come and find me or one of our other pastors and say, hey, can you talk to this person? And we would love to have that conversation with you. If you're watching the live stream right now, if you have questions, if today is the day you put your faith in Christ, would you please leave a comment right now and let us know that? The magicians got the instruction that they were meant to get. It didn't humble them, and they didn't submit to Yahweh in faith, but they got the instruction and they shared their impressions with Pharaoh. Sadly, Pharaoh's heart was hard and he paid no attention, and so we cannot miss the ignoring of the gnats. The ignoring of the gnats. Not surprisingly, Pharaoh failed to get the instruction that the magicians were getting. And with his hardened heart, verse 19, he refused to listen, as the Lord had said back in chapter 7, verse 4. That's all we know about this third plague. We don't know how it ended, but we know that it had not been sufficient for Pharaoh to let the Israelite slaves go. And so God continued to send more plagues. Look at verses 20 through 32. Then the Lord said to Moses, rise up early in the morning and present yourself to Pharaoh as he goes out to the water, and say to him, thus says the Lord, let my people go, that they may serve me. Or else, if you will not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies on you and your servants and your people and into your houses, and the houses of the Egyptians shall be filled with swarms of flies, and also the ground on which they stand. But on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there, that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. There it is. Why is he sending the plagues? That you may know that I am Yahweh, that Yahweh is God in the midst of the earth. Verse 23, thus I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall happen. And the Lord did so. There came great swarms of flies into the house of Pharaoh and into his servants' houses throughout all the land of Egypt. The land was ruined by the swarms of flies. Then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, go, sacrifice to your God within the land. But Moses said, it would not be right to do so, For the offerings we shall sacrifice to the Lord our God are an abomination to the Egyptians. If we sacrifice offerings abominable to the Egyptians before their eyes, will they not stone us? We must go 3 days' journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God as he tells us. So Pharaoh said, I will let you go to sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, only you must not go very far away. Plead for me. Then Moses said, Behold, I am going out from you, and I will plead with the Lord that the swarms of flies may depart from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people tomorrow. Only let not Pharaoh cheat again by not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. So Moses went out from Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord, and the Lord did so, did as Moses asked, and removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people. Not one remained. But Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also, and did not let the people go. And so here in these verses we learn of the destruction of Egypt. Point number 2, the destruction of Egypt. Like every other plague, we read the words, the Lord said to Moses. I mentioned that last week. Each plague begins with the Lord speaking to Moses, and we see that in verse 20. Unlike the third plague, Moses is once again instructed to present himself once again to Pharaoh. So let's talk about the confrontation. The confrontation. Notice in verse 20, God instructs Moses to present himself to Pharaoh in the morning as he goes out to the water. Now, I mentioned a couple of weeks ago with the first plague that we saw this happen. We'll see it again before we get through this series, where Moses confronts Pharaoh in the morning as he's coming to the water. But I explained a couple of weeks ago that the reason most likely that Pharaoh was coming to the water every morning was to worship some of their gods, particularly the river gods. And I described this to you. There were Osiris and Nu and Hapi. Last week we talked about their creator god Noom and his goddess wife Hecht. And it's possible that he was coming out to worship some of these gods as he was coming to the river. Even though God had plagued the river, even though God had shown that these pagan gods of the river were nothing more than figments of that heathen people's collective imaginations, Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not budge from his false beliefs. He would not give up his errant worldview, and so he persisted in going to the river to worship these false gods. Moses was to meet him there and once again present the command for the king to let the people of Yahweh go so that they could serve him. Again, there's a lot of reasons Pharaoh wouldn't do this, but one, it was more than just that he stand to lose his free labor with this enslaved workforce. He also stood to lose great wealth, and even more, he stood to lose a lot of respect. Remember, he believed himself to be the manifestation of all the Egyptian gods. But the people of Egypt also believed that. They believed that Pharaoh was the manifestation of all their gods, their whole pantheon of gods. And so for Pharaoh to show any kind of sign of weakness and to give in to the demands of this foreign god, this Hebrew god, he just was not going to do that. And you couple that with the fact that God had hardened his heart, and he has this hard heart, he just was not going to give in. And so there we come with to verse 21, where we see the consequence of his failure, his refusal to comply. The consequence. When Pharaoh refused to let the people go, he received the warning that there would be this fourth plague of flies. These flies would be on Pharaoh and his people. You see that? It would be on them, and it would be in their houses. In fact, it says swarms of flies would fill their houses and would even cover the ground on which they stood. Now imagine that, all right? How many of you like bugs? Any bug people here? Okay, not a one of you. So you're probably all going to understand that if you can imagine the floor of your house is completely covered in bugs. Let me ask you this. How many people have ever stepped on a spider before? Okay, I've got some people that, I stepped on a spider. You know when they're a little bit bigger, and you step on them and they kind of crunch a little bit? Imagine every step you take hearing loud crunching as the ground is covered with these flies. Imagine the grossness of their guts spilling out, and it's slippery and slimy and disgusting. That's kind of what this plague turned out to be. But also, then figure this, that every time you stepped on these bugs and heard the crunching of them, you're killing something that's kind of sacred to you. And that, for the Egyptians, that was the case. I'll explain that to you as we go on. But first, I want you to see that whatever flies these were, and there's been a lot of debate by scholars through the years what kind of flies they were, but they probably were not what we would call flies, or like the house flies. That's what we would typically think as a fly. It probably was not that, because in Psalm 78, verse 45, the psalmist wrote about this plague. And he described it this way: He sent, that is God, sent among them swarms of flies which devoured them. So this is probably some kind of biting fly. And there are flies that bite. I remember when I was young, back in between high school, or after high school and while I was in college, worked for a couple summers at a Christian Christ-centered camp. And every morning I would get up out of the cabin where the kids were. I was counseling, and I'd go to take a shower. And in the morning hours especially, I'd always have to remember to wear a hat, because there were these deer flies. How many of you know what deer flies are? These deer flies, they for some reason, they love hair. And they get in your hair, but they can bite. And you don't really want those deer flies around. There's other flies, horse flies bite. There's all kinds of flies that bite. And it's probably some kind of biting fly. But the word swarms, you say, well, which kind of fly was it? Was it a deer fly? Was it a horse fly? What kind of fly? We don't know. But the word swarms in verse 21 denotes multiple kinds of flies. So this may not have just been one kind of fly, but multiple kinds of flies. Now, if one of those kinds of flies was the ichneumon fly, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, I have no idea, but the ichneumon fly, if it was that, the Egyptians would not have been able to take a fly swatter after those, because they believed that the ichneumon fly was the manifestation of one of their goddesses that they called Wadjet. Now you're looking at that name saying, how do you get Wadjet? Okay. Do we have any ancient Egyptian scholars here? None? Okay. It's pronounced Wadjet. Okay. And if I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. But no, I'm pretty sure that's how it's pronounced. But they believe that this Wadjet was the goddess of the marshes. And they believed that the ichneumon fly was the manifestation of their god. Well, let's go back to them covering the ground. Every step you take, you're crunching down on some of these flies that have this significance. This is the manifestation of our goddess of the marshes that we're stepping on and crushing and spreading her guts all over the floor. And then if one of these kinds of flies were flying beetles, there are flying beetles. If that were the case, that would have posed a problem to the Egyptians, because they believed that the beetle was the symbol of their sun god, Capri. And of course, these swarms of flies certainly brought to mind the Egyptian god Sutekh. You say, well, who is Sutekh? What's Sutekh? Sutekh was actually a precursor to the later Canaanite god that we know as Baal-zebub. In the New Testament, he goes by Beelzebul or Beelzebub. Matthew 12, verse 24, he's called the Prince of Demons. So we're talking really about the worship of Satan here. But Beelzebub is known as the Lord of the, anyone know? The Lord of the Flies. Here's this plague of the swarms of flies was a direct assault, a judgment on one of the gods of Egypt named Sutekh, who was the Egyptian lord of the flies, and may very well have been a direct assault at Satan, who was setting himself up as this God to be worshipped. If not setting himself up, certainly was setting up these false gods to lead the Egyptian people astray. And so Yahweh is showing the Egyptian people that their gods were not real, and that he was the one true and sovereign God. So this fourth plague was a severe consequence for Pharaoh's failure to obey. But the amazement of this miracle is really seen in verses 22 and 23, where we see the confirmation. The confirmation. As though these plagues hadn't done enough to demonstrate God's almighty and limitless power, he gives Pharaoh further confirmation of his power by setting apart the land of Goshen, where his people, the Israelites, lived, and protecting them from this plague. Now, I mentioned earlier that I would come back to the inundation that we talked about in the third plague. And we know it was an inundation because back in verses 16 and 17, it says that the gnats were in all the land of Egypt. They were everywhere. That would include Goshen, as Goshen was a part of Egypt. So the Israelites had the gnats as well. The Israelites suffered through that plague as well. Okay? But now we see that this time God would protect the Israelites from a plague. And what's remarkable about this is you can see there on the map, Goshen is located right in the heart of Egypt. Don't imagine Goshen is like this far-off region that, it's not that surprising that the plague didn't reach them all the way over there in Goshen. No, Goshen was right there in the heart of Egypt. By all accounts, the flies should have covered Goshen just as it covered everywhere else. But it didn't. God was confirming to Pharaoh through this protection of his people. And by the way, this won't be the last time that God's people are protected from the plagues. But God is showing Pharaoh that he is sovereign and that his gods are weak and worthless and false, that they're not real. Now, this is also confirmed by the fact in verse 23, you see that Moses conveys Yahweh's message that this plague would happen the next day. It'll happen tomorrow. If Pharaoh thought that this was just some silly, empty scare tactic, how could he possibly explain what happened the next day when, verse 24, swarms and swarms of flies began to suddenly inundate his house and all the houses of all his people? How could he explain away the comfort and security of the Israelites who had no flies buzzing around them in Goshen? No bites or devouring of the flies. No flies covering the ground where they walked, making a slimy, slippery, disgusting mess. He couldn't explain these things. Yahweh was confirming this miracle to Pharaoh. And notice at the end of verse 24, it says that the flies were ruining the land. That's why this second point is called the destruction of Egypt, because that's what Pharaoh saw. These flies are ruining the land. Now, it wasn't that the flies were ruining the vegetation of the land. Those plagues are yet to come. There's going to be hail and locusts coming. But this particular plague, it's not destroying vegetation. It's not really having an impact on the land as much as it is. It's destroying what Pharaoh believed to be paradise. He believed that Egypt was this paradise, and now these flies are ruining that. And so Pharaoh, he's ready to make a deal with Moses, and that brings us to the compromise. The compromise. What did God demand through Moses? He said, "Let my people go." Right? Did God want them in Egypt, or did he want them out of Egypt? He wanted them out of Egypt. He wanted them to go all the way to Mount Sinai and worship him there at Mount Sinai. And that's what God demanded, that his people would be let go. What was Pharaoh offering? He says, "You can worship, but you have to do so here in Egypt." Pharaoh is offering a compromise. Usually compromises are made between two positions of strength, right? You got two people that almost like they're on equal footing and they can't agree, and so you have to reach a compromise to get something done. Something they're not very good at doing in Washington, D.C., but that's typically we think of as compromise. You got two positions of strength and power saying, okay, we'll come to a compromise. Let me ask you this: what strength did Pharaoh have? What bargaining chips did he have to bring to the table? He had none. And all these plagues, all these miracles of God were proving to Pharaoh that his gods are non-existent and worthless and nothing, and that he is weak, that he is impotent, and there was no really feet for him to stand on here to make this compromise. And yet some people might have been tempted to accept this compromise, figuring, hey, I never thought the king would even offer this much. This is the best we're ever going to get from him, so let's go ahead and accept the offer. But as we see in verses 26 and 27, Moses refused to compromise. Good for him. That brings us now to the commitment. The commitment. First, Moses, who, by the way, has no welts on his body from fly bites. He's not swatting the flies away like Pharaoh was. But Moses points out that Pharaoh's plan would never work because the Egyptians would revolt and riot when they saw the Israelites offering their sacrifices. Why would the Egyptians have a problem with that? Well, the Egyptian god Apis was depicted as a bull, and bulls were sacred to the Egyptians. What do you think would happen when the Egyptians saw the Israelites sacrificing and slaughtering a bull? Think they'd be happy about that? There was the goddess Hathor, who was associated with calves. There was the god Ammon, was represented as a ram. What do you think the Egyptians would do if they saw the Israelite slaves slaughtering in sacrifice the animals that they believed to be sacred? It'd be akin to doing a pig roast at a synagogue, or grilling up burgers outside the Hindu temple. This would not go well. It would offend the people. It would make them angry, and violence would break out. And so Moses says, we can't do that. And in verse 27, Moses says, we must go 3 days' journey into the wilderness. And with that, we see Moses' commitment to the will of God. And some people say, but wait a minute, Pastor Mike, I don't know for sure, but it sure sounds like it'd take more than 3 days to get from Egypt to Mount Sinai. How many of you think it would take more than 3 days on foot to get from Egypt to Mount Sinai? You can go ahead and raise your hand on this one, okay? This is not a trick question. It would definitely take more than 3 days. So was Moses lying here? No, the answer is no. In fact, if you go back, God originally told Moses to go to Pharaoh and say, we need to go on a 3 days journey. We saw that last year, and we read that in chapter 3, verse 18. That was God's instruction. And it's not a lie. It's not that God was trying to pull the wool over Pharaoh's eyes. Culturally speaking, a 3-day journey was akin to saying a journey of indeterminate period of time. We could say, I'm going to be gone for a long time. I'm going to be gone for several days. When you don't really know for sure how long it's going to be. That was the idea behind this, and it was just meant to be sort of the way to get this negotiation or this demand worded in a way that Moses could understand. So Moses was not settling for less than what God wanted. He was rejecting Pharaoh's compromise and remaining committed to the will of God. So in verse 28, Pharaoh, with little choice, because he's in a position of total weakness here, he bends a little bit further, and in verses 28 through 31, we see the contract. Okay, the contract. Now, a contract, by definition, is mutually beneficial and is breakable by any party that no longer is benefiting from it. In verse 28, Pharaoh offers to let the Israelites leave Egypt, though he stipulates that they are not to go very far. Now, Pharaoh had to know that even with that stipulation, he knew that by letting the Israelites go out of Egypt, he was going to lose his enslaved workforce. But he needed relief from the flies, and so he tells Moses, you can go, but first, he says, plead for me. There's the contract. I'll let you go, but first, you have to plead for me. Mutual benefit. Okay, and so once again, Pharaoh realizes that he and his gods were powerless against this plague. He seeks the help from Yahweh. We saw that last week with the plague of the frogs. He asked Moses to plead for him. And in verse 29, Moses agrees to the terms of the contract, promising to plead with Yahweh about the flies. But he reminds Pharaoh of his obligation in this agreement that at the end of verse 29, he says, don't cheat again. Pharaoh, you cheated. You reneged last time. Remember the frogs? You see those stinking piles of frog flesh out there? You promised, and you reneged on that promise. He says, don't cheat again. In verse 30, Moses prayed for the Egyptian king. Let me say that again. In verse 30, Moses prayed for the Egyptian king. You think that was easy for Moses to do? How many of you think, oh boy, that was probably easy for him to do? This Egyptian king had been mocking you and mocking your God and has made life miserable for your people and has mistreated you and has gone back on his word. He's lied to you. There's all these reasons for Moses to say, man, I will never pray for that guy. But Moses went and he prayed for the Egyptian king. I'm reminded of Jesus' words in Matthew 5, verse 44, when he said, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. You know, that's not the default response for sinners, to pray for those who persecute, to pray for those who are enemies. The default response for sinners is to hate those people, to reject those people. And yet God wants us to respond differently. Why? Because the power of sin has been broken in our hearts and lives. Amen? He wants us to respond differently. He says, pray for those who persecute you. Love your enemies. 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 and 2, Paul wrote, first of all, then I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings, and all who are in high positions. Friends, Moses did this. The word translated as prayer actually means to intercede for others. Can I ask you, friends, do you pray for other people? And when you do you pray for your enemies? Or for those who persecute you? Or for those with whom you don't see eye to eye? Do you pray for those who have hurt you or who have lied to you? Moses did. He prayed that the flies would be removed from Pharaoh. And in verse 31, Yahweh not only heard his prayer, but he answered that prayer. Not one single fly was left in Egypt. Moses honored his contractual commitment to Pharaoh, but as we see in verse 32, Pharaoh failed to do the same. In verse 32, we see the cheat. The cheat. Moses said, don't cheat me. And that's exactly what Pharaoh did. He cheated. Pharaoh was not true to his word. Again, contracts can be broken, and Pharaoh broke this contract. But thankfully, God has entered into a covenant with his people, with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God would fulfill his promise. It's just going to take another 6 plagues to get there. What now? What now? There's 2 things I want to leave you with real quick. First, in the 3rd plague, the gnats were everywhere. It was an inundation of gnats. And so obedience meant hardship for Moses. For Moses to tell Aaron to strike the dust of the earth so that they become gnats, he knew that means we're going to be covered with these insects. We're going to be irritated by these insects. We're going to face this hardship. You know, friends, sometimes obedience is not easy, and it can at times lead to hardship. Sometimes disobedience is easier than obedience. Have you ever found that to be true? Friends, I want you to understand obedience is always crucially important. For Kelly and me, obedience to God means living in Southwest Florida when every one of our kids lives like 1,000 miles away. When my mom, who's 87 years old, thank you, and Kelly's parents, who are not quite as old as that, but they're getting there, are all, 1,000 miles away up in Michigan. I just want to share with you, yesterday morning, I was getting my breakfast ready, and I didn't even know that Kelly's phone had rung, that anyone had called her. She was in the bedroom. She came out of the bedroom, and she's got tears running down her face. I'm like, oh boy, what's happened? She said, my mom called. Oh no, what's wrong? And found out her dad is in the hospital. I think he's going to be okay. I haven't heard the conclusion to this yet, but there's a concern. You know, it's hard for Kelly to be 1,000 miles away when her dad's in the hospital, and her mom is at home recovering from her own episode just a few weeks ago of falling and breaking her leg. And now she's home alone. Now, thankfully, we have an eldest son who is in West Michigan, and he agreed to drive over there last night and to spend the night with Grandma and help take care of her. But that's hard. That's hard for us to be away. I can only imagine what it'll be like when grandkids start to come and the sacrifice that we make. Listen, it's not always easy to obey God, and sometimes obedience means hardship. Friends, trust God and obey Him always. Trust God and obey Him always. To do that, you need to keep eternity in view. When we can view this life through the lens of eternity and know that this life is nothing, it's a mist, a vapor that is here for a moment and passes away. When we can keep our focus on eternity, we live this life a different kind of way. When we can focus on eternity, the choices we make, the priorities we keep are all different. We need to keep our eyes on eternity, and we need to be willing to suffer hardship for the glory of God. Be willing to suffer hardship for the glory of God. Second thing I want to leave with you, and with this I close. Pharaoh he offered Moses a compromise. But Moses was committed to God's will, and he refused to compromise. We live in a world that constantly tempts us to compromise. It might be a boss who wants you to fudge your expense report. It could be a Little League coach who wants your kids to practice on Sunday morning. We ran into that when our boys were playing Little League. I was actually an assistant coach on that team, and the guy who was the head coach was like, we're going to have practice on Sunday. And I said, no, we're not going to be here. And he knew not to argue because he knew I was a pastor, so he wasn't going to argue with me about it. But there's opportunities for compromise all the time. Young people, maybe you have friends who want you to do things you know that you shouldn't do, you know that are wrong. Maybe you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend who wants you to push the physical boundaries in your relationship when you know that would dishonor the Lord. Perhaps it's a motion picture company that wants you to accept a little foul language or a few lurid scenes in order to enjoy your favorite movies. Brothers and sisters, refuse to compromise. Refuse to compromise. Now, to do that, you need to know God's holy and revealed will. A lot of people are like, how can I know what God's will is? The answer is very easy. God has revealed His will in this book. We know what God's will is because it's written down for us in this book. We need to know this book. We need to be in the Word every day so that we can know God's holy and revealed will. Second, you need to establish a personal standard for holiness. And that standard for holiness should be in line 100% with God's revealed and holy will as revealed in this book. You need to know, what will I do and what will I not do? What will I say and what will I not say? What will I accept as entertainment and what will I refuse as entertainment? Establish that standard for holiness, for personal holiness in your life. And then finally, you need to stick to that standard. Stick to that standard and strive after holiness. Friends, do not compromise.